Hello and welcome to my poster on multiple pitch perception in listeners with mild to moderate hearing loss. In everyday listening situations, we often have to track multiple sound sources, each of which may have a different pitch. Pitch is the feature of sound related to the overall repetition rate of that sound or its fundamental frequency. It separates sounds into low and high, and it's a critical organizing feature for music. In speech, you might, most of the time, need to hear multiple pitches if you're listening to one target voice and isolating that voice and ignoring the pitch of masking voices. Whereas in music, it's more common to want to hear all of the pitches at the same time and even to characterize the relationship between those pitches as a chord or a harmony. And we know from previous research that even mild to moderate hearing loss can negatively affect pitch perception for single pitches presented sequentially, one after the other. And we also know that listeners with hearing loss can struggle with speech and noise perception, but we don't understand very well yet what the effects of mild to moderate hearing loss are on multiple pitch perception when you have to hear out either one pitch in a mixture or characterize the entire mixture of pitches, which is very relevant to music perception. So in this study, we had listeners do three tasks involving pitch perception, three tasks of different levels of complexity and integration with music, and we had listeners who were normal hearing complete this task, as well as a growing set of listeners that is so far still small as data collection is ongoing, listeners with mild to moderate hearing loss. You can see the audiograms of our participants with mild to moderate hearing loss in the methods section. We split them into sort of a mild group and a moderate group based on their thresholds at 2 kilohertz. But all of these listeners have some degree of hearing loss, more than 25 dBHL at least one frequency, less than 30 dBHL at least one frequency. In our first experiment, our listeners had to discriminate the pitch of 2 harmonic complex tones presented one after the other. We adaptively varied the distance and fundamental frequency between these harmonic complex tones so that we could measure the threshold of pitch discrimination between these tones. This is the classic way to measure a pitch discrimination threshold. And we found, sort of replicating past studies, that our listeners, especially the listeners with a greater degree of hearing loss in the moderate group, had elevated pitch discrimination thresholds relative to normal hearing listeners. In experiment 2, we had our listeners doing the same task but with maskers on the second harmonic complex tone, meaning that the second harmonic complex tone is actually the highest note in a 3-note chord or a triad. And so the listeners are just listening to the top voice of this stimulus, including the highest note of that chord. The target and reference are repeated, so you can see the four sounds in this pattern are just a repetition of the first 2. And that's to help listeners focus their attention on the highest pitch in the mixture. Our listeners with more mild hearing loss are even outperforming the normal hearing group, but that's to be taken with a large grain of salt because we only have 2 participants in that group so far. And our listeners with a greater degree of hearing loss in the moderate group are showing significant deficit relative to the normal hearing group for this task. In experiment 3, we had our listeners rating the degree of expectedness of the final chord in a 7-chord sequence. And they did this with a subjective Likert rating scale from least expected to most expected. We also had a stimulus manipulation in this experiment where we controlled for sensory priming. So in the stimuli with sensory priming, there were shared pitches between context and target, and the stimuli without, there were no shared pitches between context and target. This pattern, where regardless of sensory priming, listeners tend to rate the expected stimuli as more expected than the unexpected stimuli, emerged for our normal hearing listeners and was pretty stable for our listeners with mild hearing loss, and the listeners with moderate hearing loss in the most resolved region of low frequencies retained some of this ability. So overall, we think that mild to moderate hearing loss negatively affects multiple pitch perception when you're isolating one pitch in a mixture, but when characterizing the whole mixture, context cues may help to a small degree. Thank you for listening.